12 News Now on WPRI.com. I'm Tim White alongside my colleague, 12 News politics editor Ted Nesi. Ted, shortly before 2 p.m. on this Sunday, July 21st, President Joe Biden bowed out of the presidential race, though he did say in a letter that he is staying in office. He's going to continue to serve as president. Ted, for weeks, President Biden has been saying he's staying in this race. What do you think was the tipping point?
Well, first, Tim, we have to. This is a day that's going to go down in American history. Obviously, the closest analog I've been able to think of was 1968, when Lyndon Johnson surprised the country by going on television and saying he would not seek another term. He was beleaguered by the Vietnam War then, but that was March. That was much earlier. There were primaries still to happen, et cetera. Joe Biden, the primaries are done. Joe Biden was the nominee. He's the incumbent president. He is out of this race and endorsing Kamala Harris, his vice president, to replace him at the top of the Democratic ticket. Tim, I've said, I think publicly, I thought that debate was unsurvivable within 24 hours. It was, first of all, because it reinforced fears that voters already had, concerns that they'd said in polls for a long, long time. We did a poll at 12 News, you remember, Tim, in 2022, where only, I believe it was 40% of Democratic primary voters in Rhode Island wanted Joe Biden to run again. It had been flashing red to Democrats that a lot of voters were uncomfortable with this. And of course, Donald Trump was leading going into the debate. And then ever since then, while the president has said at times he wanted to stay in, he has by no means given the kind of vigorous campaigning. Frankly, his speaking has been very variable, as it has been for a while, and the pressure was immense. I think I knew, or I felt strongly it was headed this way Wednesday of this past week, when you had the very rapid fire leaks that Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi had both basically urged Biden to get out, warning him Congress was at risk. They might lose the House and the Senate, and Donald Trump could win a landslide. And then word that Barack Obama was concerned too. The pressure was just too great, and the money was drying up from donors.
And it had put Democrats across the country, but you've been talking to our delegation in Rhode Island and the delegation in Massachusetts. It really put these Democrats in a tough spot.
Very tough. First and foremost, look, they all want to win elections. You don't usually win elections by talking down your most important candidate in the country. Right. And I think, we were talking about this on Newsmakers Friday when we taped it, Tim, the shock was real among many Democrats, even some senior Democrats who believed Biden and his closest aides when they'd said, yeah, has he slowed down? Is his walk, kind of weak? Is he not as quick on his feet? Sure, but he's still got it. He's going to bring it in big moments. The Biden people asked for the debate because they wanted to show he could still do it, and it showed the opposite, and now he's out of the race. You saw, obviously, we aired that, I would say, fairly explosive interview with Sheldon Whitehouse the Monday after the debate, who was really one of the very first senior Democrats in Washington to say publicly what everyone was thinking, which is, can he go and win, or is this just how he is these days? And Sheldon Whitehouse, as recently as this week, was still unable to express confidence that Biden was okay. He never called for him to drop out. But it reminds me, Tim, in other countries in a parliament system, there can be a vote of no confidence in the leader. And we don't have that system in America, but effectively, you had top Democrats voting no confidence at this point in Joe Biden. Just this morning, there was a poll in Michigan, Donald Trump opening up a big lead in a state Joe Biden has to win. So there was just, if he had stayed in, it was very, very, very hard to see how he'd win. And it was also very easy to imagine how he could take down a lot of other Democrats who might have a fighting chance with a stronger ticket.
All right, let's look ahead now, Ted, and we want to talk about the mechanics of what happens next. But first of all, as I mentioned at the top of this, President Biden said he's going to continue to serve out the rest of his term. You have to imagine, if it isn't already happening as you and I are talking right now, that there will be calls, particularly on the right, raising questions about whether or not, if he can't continue to campaign, how can he continue to serve the country?
Yes, and I believe J.D. Vance, the newly minted Republican vice presidential nominee, is one of those people who has said, wait a minute, Democrats are suddenly saying they don't trust this person to run for office, even though they were ready to nominate him just a month ago. How can he continue to be the president of the United States, the commander-in-chief, have the nuclear codes and all the rest? The argument so far you've heard from Democrats privately is what they plan to say is there's a difference between being able to do two jobs at once this year, which is run for president and be the president, plus have confidence that someone can still do that job all the way in 2029, which is when he would be leaving office if he were to win again. That's different from saying he's going to stay on for another 6 months or so as president. But that said, I do think that's going to be a continued question that Democrats are going to face. And frankly, it's rightly a question to be asked because the White House did not prepare everyone for what he'd be like in the debate. So it's understandable if people have a bit of the old Ronald Reagan trust but verify about how Biden is today. But again, I also don't want to skip over just my history and politics brain just marveling at the news today. A sitting president who a month ago, Tim, the debate hadn't happened a month ago, was certainly in contention to win re-election, and there was not a hint of any of this. And now he's out of the presidential race. Just again, an extraordinary day in American history.
So he did not endorse Kamala Harris, Vice President Kamala Harris, in the letter, but he did separately a full-throated endorsement saying that she should be the Democratic nominee for president. But just because Joe Biden says it doesn't automatically guarantee that Kamala Harris will be the nominee.
No, he doesn't get to just, it's not his nomination to hand to someone else. But that said, we've seen a rallying around Harris, I would say, over the course of the sort of disintegration of Biden's campaign the last couple of weeks. Part of why he ran was because so many Democrats didn't have confidence Kamala Harris could step up and replace him on the ticket this year. The White House, it's been clear from reporting in Washington that there are a lot of people in Biden's orbit who didn't have a lot of faith in her. But I think people think she's acquitted herself well in a very difficult situation the last few weeks. People talking about her boss, stepping out, her becoming the presidential nominee, the loyalty required of that, while also preparing yourself to potentially take on this huge task. I do think, Democrats have gone through a trauma. I would say they're going through a trauma now. There's plenty of Democrats who are still saying Joe Biden should stay in the race. I don't know how they're all going to feel this afternoon and evening as they see that the pressure campaign from other Democrats worked. So I think the idea of further ripping the party apart, to have a big open convention with heavy hitters like Gavin Newsom, like Gretchen Whitmer from Michigan and others running against Vice President Harris, it's hard for me to see a big appetite for it. Now, I can't rule it out, and others may jump in, right? Some lower tier people, but it's a tough calculus, right? For those Democrats who say, we've already gone through a lot. The president says he wants Kamala Harris, his number two, to take over. People have sort of voted for her because they've been voting for the Biden-Harris ticket. She's in a very, very strong position. And we should say she was in our region overnight, by the way, because she was in Provincetown just yesterday for a big, well-received fundraiser.
That's right, she was. And of course, if she is the nominee, there will be some jockeying for who will be joining her on the ticket. Okay, like I said, the mechanics, I think a lot of people, Ted, are going to have questions about, well, what happens to PAC money is different, but to the money that people donated to Joe Biden, the candidate, and then what happens to the delegates?
So on the money, my understanding, and I admit this gets complicated, and I'm not going to claim to be the expert everyone should turn to, but my understanding from everything I've read is that Harris has the easiest time taking over the existing Biden-Harris operation, including the money, because she's part of the ticket. Whereas if another Democrat were to replace her on the ticket, there's been talk that the money would have to be transferred out of the campaign, maybe into the Democratic National Committee or something like that. So there's also a cleanest. I mean, you also have to include the fact that Harris, some of these other Democrats look good in part because they haven't been tested on the national stage, right? And, they may look great. Candidates always look great until they get into a race, I've learned over the years covering politics. And then you see them warts and all, and they get tested. So there's also a feeling when Democrats, she knows what it's like to have to be at this level or nearly at the level that Biden was at, and maybe is just more ready for that. On the delegates, again, my understanding, and again, acknowledging this is arcane, is Biden will be releasing his delegates, urging them, but not able to force them to support Harris, as we're seeing today. And I believe they will be open to vote for who they want at the convention, which, by the way, is another interesting thing for all the people who got elected in that we did a story, Tim, what was it, 5% turnout in that presidential primary back in April in Rhode Island. Those people have become very important because they are now actually, we haven't had the convention really choosing the nominee like they did in the old days since the late 60s.
Right.
It's been the primaries. So we've been in uncharted waters, feels like for years now. We are really in uncharted waters right now.
Well, as you said multiple times, Ted, this is an historic day and a historic announcement, and one that's going to be dominating the American psyche for the months to come. For Ted Nesi, I'm Tim White. This is WPRI.com.